Hey everyone, Derek here to answer your questions about Kirby Star Allies on the Switch. We got the review code in last week, and I've had a chance to play at least a little bit of it. Not much more since I've done my preview, unfortunately, mainly because I've been focusing on Switch Week. However, I am able to answer a lot of your questions, and if I didn't answer it, it's either because it's a repeat, or I couldn't talk about it, or I didn't have the knowledge about it. For example, any questions about multiplayer I couldn't really answer. Now, I am planning to fix the multiplayer situation this week as I'm going to go play with some friends, but before that I really can't answer any questions about the multiplayer, so I do apologize for that, but I will have something to say by the time of the review because I know that's a key component of Star Allies. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into our questions, and first up is Alpha Charizard, who asks, how many collectibles are in the game? Well, it honestly is treated a little differently from the Kirby games on the 3DS. There, you had a collectible like the keychain or the stickers, along with a level collectible like the Sunstone or the Code Cube, which unlocked further levels, allowed you to progress further, and stuff like that. That is not the structure of Star Allies. Instead, the puzzle pieces act like Street Pass. The smaller puzzle pieces you collect fill in the gaps around the edges, while the big puzzle pieces that you can find in each level fill in the pink areas. And in that way you slowly fill in the artwork. Otherwise though, there really aren't any other collectibles to discover in each of the levels. Instead, certain levels have a special switch that you can find, which then opens up an extra level. So the level you go into will always have an indication saying, hey, this is available now, so when you go into that level you can search for it and make sure you open up the way to the extra level. So it is handled a little bit differently from the 3DS games, and I'm still deciding whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So we'll see how I feel come review. Next up is Lewis, or Shady Knight, who asks, is Swole DDD truly the dreamiest thing in Star Allies? I don't know, he's pretty close. It is a magnificent transformation, but you'll be surprised just how early on you fight DDD in this game. I'm so used to the other games where he comes in a little later before the big boss. So it's treated a little differently here, which I don't mind. It's just a little surprising considering how much they've highlighted Swole DDD up till this point. But that said, it makes sense. It's Swole DDD, it's pretty great. Next up is Elascore, who wants to know, what is my favorite combined power-up so far? Oh man, that is a hard one because there's a lot of great ones. There's some very simple ones like a physical weapon and an elemental ability, and just seeing how they expand and get better. Those are a lot of fun. You have others that are just sort of silly, like with fighting where all you do is just toss your friend all around and wreak havoc on the screen. Some really fun ones, but most of them fall into the category of just this ability and this element. And honestly, Yo-Yo in most elements is a lot of fun. They're just seeing how they interact and seeing what they do is just really cool to see, and I think that it's one of the more obvious ways you can see how getting an extra element can really change up the properties and what you might do. I showed a little bit of that off during my demo playthrough, but yeah, I'd say Yo-Yo in most elements. There might be others, but I don't want to give too much away. Next up is Rob Lawler, who wants to know, based on pre-release footage, some have likened the game to Kirby 64. Would you say that's an accurate comparison? Not quite. It is close because you do combine powers quite a bit, but it's combined in a very different way to 64, where it just is your ability once you combine those powers, and you combine in the way you throw them into each other and everything else. It is a very different feel. I actually don't think of 64 that much when I'm combining powers. It really is just sort of its own thing, or a little closer to Superstar. It feels like a natural extension of what you could do in Superstar, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I like that it feels a little separate from 64, even though I know people love how you could combine powers in 64. But the problem with having combinations like 64 is that a lot of powers get left on the sideline. So it makes sense that they decided to go for the more simplistic combinations because they wanted to get as many powers in there as possible. I don't mind it, but I never really had the thought that it felt like Kirby 64. JJ hashtag Team Grima wants to know, how long is Star Allies compared to other Kirby games? Is it easier or harder? This is a very common question about Kirby's difficulty as well as its length. Unfortunately, I can't really say how long the game is truly, mainly because I'm still playing through it. I had to put it on the back burner because of all of our Switch Week coverage, but I will say it took me about 4 hours to get through the first 3 worlds. The other hour that I put in my preview to make it 5 hours is from the Minigames, messing around with different features, seeing what you could really do, and just getting a sense of the game as a whole without actually making any forward progress. So I'd say say roughly 3.5 to 4 hours to get through the first 3 worlds, but I don't know how much bigger it's going to be as I go along. So I don't want to give you guys a solid time frame yet, especially since a lot of you are going to be going for 100% and that could add in a lot of time. So I'll just have to hold off on that for now. As far as the difficulty, that's a little trickier to go by, because here's the thing, Kirby is naturally just an easy game. It's meant to be an easy series. It's not really going to give you much of a challenge. However, this one does seem a little easier than past games. The biggest example of this is I wanted to see what the game over screen was like. I wanted to see if there's any cool little details, and there's a little callback to Superstar, but it's really nothing major, so it really wasn't worth making its own video out of, but you can take a look yourself. However, you take very little damage from enemies, at least in the first world, and that seems to apply as you continue on. And there's only one pit in all of World 1. So I had to get to World 2 and throw myself in the first pit. Fortunately, as soon as you get to World 2, there's a pit right away, and you can toss yourself in it and quickly kill yourself in order to get that game over screen, at least in my case. But yeah, in all of World 1, there's only one pit, and that's not necessarily a bad thing in my opinion. It's a way to ease players into the game. You might give it to young kids and they'll still have fun and be able to do everything. Like, a low difficulty in Kirby does not bother me. However, if it's still not a challenge when I get to the extra modes, that's when I'm going to be a little concerned. But as far as the main playthrough, you're really not going to find too much of a challenge. So just a heads up there. Tyler Phantom Thief wants to know, do you need to have the CPU buddy characters all the time, or can you play the game solo without them for most of the time? You can absolutely play solo, you do not need to have them. There's a few cases where you need 1 extra buddy or 3 extra buddies in order to make some forward progress, but for the most part, you do not need them there. There's a way to instantly dismiss them, so if you just want to get past a certain section, you can make some friends, clear the way forward, and immediately dismiss them and continue along the way. So if you want to play this completely on your own, that is absolutely an option, but there are some cases where you'll need an extra friend in order to get one of the big puzzle pieces or just progress in general, so something to keep in mind there. CC5000YT wants to know, are you able to play with a Pro Controller? Yes, there's a lot of control options. You can use both Joy-Cons, you can use a Joy-Con on its side, you can use the Pro Controller. Any way is possible, and it's really just a comfortable experience. Next up is Can Dances, who wants to know, do the loading screens ever get too intrusive? Has there been a moment where there were a couple back-to-back, or a moment where one ruined the pacing? So I did mention this in my preview where the loading screens between going to each area did get a little intrusive as I was going through. It's not all the time, and I kind of had it in the back of my mind in some places, but I'd say the instances where they're the most apparent is during the friend combinations when you have all 4 buddies with you. And some of them aren't too bad, like the friend star, because you can go at your own pace and explore and do whatever you want. But then there's the friend train, and as you go along, you have these relatively big sections that you're going through, but you're like going along, feeling good, load screen. Okay, going along, feeling good, load screen. And it does kind of break up the pacing somewhat. I don't think it's a major issue. It's more of an annoyance in my opinion, but it is there and it might break up some of the flow. But yeah, I would only consider that a minor annoyance. Outdated Pidge wants to know, what bonus games are included? Well, the only 2 you have access to as soon as you boot up the game are the new, very much mini-games, Chop Champs and Star Slam Heroes. Chop Champs is basically just cutting down a tree while avoiding worms and sending Gordos at each other, so it's very much almost a rhythm game as you're just trying to chop as quickly as possible and move to the proper place. It's simple but pretty fun. Star Slam Heroes is about hitting a meteor back into space with a baseball bat, and it's very much like Megaton Punch where you're setting the power and you're setting the accuracy, and that determines how far it'll actually go out. And the harder difficulties, there's more inputs for you to set that accuracy and power, so it becomes a little bit more complex. Now there is a space for 2 more extra modes, but those are unlocked once I beat the game, and unfortunately I haven't done that yet. And if it's anything like the other games, and there's, let's say one of those is the arena, which I honestly do not know that, the true arena would of course pop up as well. So I'm not quite sure how much extra there is beyond these minigames, and these minigames again are along the lines of Superstar where they're just sort of little fun things that you can play with your friends, but they really won't keep you there for that long. Samurai Bry wants to know, how much, if at all, do your ally character's moves differ compared to Kirby's copy ability of the same ally? Like, for example, if Bonker were to use his hammer throw attack, will he just vanish or just whip out a new hammer like DDD and return to Dreamland in DDD Tour? The allies that you recruit work exactly like Kirby does with that power, so there's really no difference between them. You can do whatever you like, and that'll be that. It really is just basically Kirby's moveset just with that character. Zlaker at 12 days wants to know, if you've created a friend ability in a previous level, i.e. Sizzle Sword, will that same animation play if you create it in a different level? No. If you go into the options, there's a way to change that. You can have it only appear the first time that appears in any level. So you get it in the first level, it will never appear again. If you get it in a later level and that's the first time you've ever had that combination, it'll only play that one time. So it never plays again, or if you want, you can just set it to never happen, and it never has a big highlight saying, hey, you have this power now. So there's a lot of options to play with, so it never really annoys you. Ethan G wants to know, do you think its new features are sufficient to make it a new Kirby game? I do. This does feel different from what's come before. It has a Superstar flavor, but it's also very different from Superstar because of the combinations. It has combinations, but as I said, it doesn't really feel like Kirby 64, and it's a lot more expansive than Squeak Squad. So it's sort of taken these elements, but very much making its own thing. And I think it does feel like a new Kirby game. The issue might be is if you're tired of the Kirby formula, because it very much follows that formula, but it's been remixed as far as the details. Next up is Taro Vidya, who wants to know, seeing water return as an ability, I'm left to wonder, is the poison copy ability from Kirby Planet Robobot cut? Since both it and water share a few similarities, I'm worried it might be gone. It was my favorite. Unfortunately, I have not seen hide nor hair of poison. There's been no indication in pre-release that it might be there, and I don't think it's actually in the game. So unfortunately, there's no poison ability here. Although that would have been a good choice considering you could have like a poison sword, poison cutter, stuff like that. It would have worked as an extra element. It just didn't actually make the cut. At least as far as what I've played. It could pop up later, but I'm gonna say probably not. Nitro Nintendo LPer wants to know, what is the difficulty like when going for the collectibles? Also, are the side modes just as fun as the ones before? So the difficulty of going for the collectibles, honestly, it feels pretty simple. None of these collectibles seem as hidden as the ones from Planet Robobot and Triple Deluxe, and even those weren't that hidden. They weren't that hard to find outside of a few examples, but here, up for the first 3 worlds, I've had almost no issues finding these secrets. As for the side modes, I already covered the minigames, and I don't really have any experience with the unlockable modes after you beat the game, so unfortunately I can't answer that question. Next up is Nerbion, who wants to know, in the demos option, I noticed a Type A button layout. Are there other button mapping options like B equals jump and Y equals inhale? Yes, I immediately checked that. Now I did say during my stream that it felt weird to go back to A as jump and B as inhale, because for whatever reason, I did not think that was the layout for the 3DS. And I had no issues with it there, but for some reason, I don't like it when I'm on a console. I like having B as jump and Y as inhale. And fortunately, you can change it to that setup by choosing Type B. But those are the only 2 options. There's only Type A and Type B. You can't customize to however you want. It's just those 2. In addition, during the demo, you might notice the little indicator of what the buttons do in the top right. Again, there's an option to turn that off. Nerbion also wants to know, is there a performance mode similar to Fire Emblem Warriors? He kinda has hopes for a 60 FPS experience. Unfortunately, there's no option for that whatsoever. You can't turn it down to 720p 60 frames per second. It is always 1080p 30 frames per second. There might be an update in the future, I don't know, but that does not seem to be the case here. Then we have that Michael guy who wants to know, how extensive is the combination ability? Would each copy ability have around 3 co-op abilities or perhaps less? It really does change. Like the ones that are the most common is a physical attack plus a elemental ability. Like any of those work. So you can have fire sword, water sword, ice sword, wind sword, electric sword, and I think that covers all the elements. And there you go, you have 5 different combinations with that one ability. And it applies to cutter, it applies to whip, any physical ability. But then there's exceptions like fighter, which doesn't get any elemental abilities and instead just throws your friends around. So there's some that have a lot of different combinations and others that only have a few or one. Like for example, Spider only has the friend trampoline. But Artist has the refrigerator friend ability, which feeds all your allies, or you can combine it with stone in order to have a giant painted Kirby statue. So it kind of changes from ability to ability, but for the most part it's either it can combine with all the elements or just a handful and sort of go from there. So there's some that only has 1 or 2, but there's others that have a lot more, and you sort of have to mix and match and see what you're able to do as far as those co-op abilities. Starman Kirby wants to know, how difficult are Star Allies' bosses compared to bosses from previous games? Maybe it's because I've always had my full lineup of friends fighting alongside me when I'm fighting the bosses, but they seem to go down pretty quickly. There's only 2 bosses I feel took me longer than the others, and that was Meta Knight and then the final General. Those 2 took me a little longer than the others. Otherwise though, we're hitting them constantly and their health gets drained very quickly, and it makes the bosses feel a lot shorter. Now, that might change if you go into that battle by yourself, and it might also feel completely different if there's an arena mode. So that's why I'm sort of holding out judgment, but for your main playthrough, the bosses go down pretty quickly, especially if you have friends with you. Now, the thing is, there's a lot more bosses here than what you'd think. In the first 3 worlds, I have fought 7 different bosses. So they might not last as long, but there's a lot more of them, so that's pretty exciting. Yesley Wesley wants to know, what's the extent of your control of your AIs in single player mode? Honestly, you don't really have any control of them. Basically what happens is, let's say there's grass that you want cut, but you don't have an ability that can cut the grass or burn it down. But you have an ally that's burning Leo or the Sword Knight, and if you wait there, they'll actually activate and realize, oh crap, I should do this, and cut down the grass or burn it or whatever. And there's a lot of situations like that where they'll realize, based on what you're waiting around and the context around it, that they'll actually fill in and do what they need to do. There's also the ability to ride on the computer-controlled allies so you can just do it right away, but for the most part, the allies are pretty smart. Juan K. Pan wants to know, is there only one type of enemy for each ability, being the one you can transform into your helper? And yes, there's only the one, because if you fight Mr. Frosty, and rather than take his ability, throw the friend heart at him, he'll immediately change into Chili, so you only have Chili as an option. So unfortunately, even if there's multiple options to get that ability, there's only ever the one friend. They just immediately change into it. So not a lot of variety there, but again, there's a lot of different abilities and friends that you can make, so it never really became an issue for me. Darcy Darmer wants to know, is there plenty of level variety? Is there any level you enjoy based on how different it is? And yes, there is a lot of level variety. In the first world, you're going through grasslands, you have caves, you have all kinds of different ideas that you can go through and experience. And then when you get to world 2, each level is almost its own theme. Like you have the beach, you have the lava, you have wherever else. And it really does change things up. And then World 3 is when it becomes a little bit more cohesive as far as what you're going through, and you're seeing a lot of similar ideas, but it all makes sense as far as the context of where you're at. And I think that's one of the cool things about this game, is how the worlds and how you're going through them really is kind of reflected by the levels that you go through, and it's a really cool thing. As far as anything blowing me away yet, as far as how different they are, nothing really. They're really pretty, they're beautiful levels, but I think I need to get a little farther in the game in order to see stuff that wasn't shown in the preview footage in order to really get a wow factor from these levels, which I do think is possible. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they come up with later. Witchy Brooke wants to know, does the frame rate hold up throughout the game, including cutscenes and boss fights? Yeah, it is rock solid. It never drops below 30. Never have to worry about that. It is good to go. Might Be Okay, I guess, wants to know, does every boss have an elemental weakness? From what I've seen, no, but there are certain ones that do have an elemental weakness, and that does play into some factors, so you can take longer or shorter depending on how it goes. You can probably guess which ones do and don't, like DDD doesn't have an elemental weakness, Meta Knight doesn't have an elemental weakness, but if you fight against Francisca and you have electricity, well, you might be in a little bit better shape. So it's something to keep in mind. It's not a major thing, but it is just that little bit of extra help to get you through certain bosses and enemies. I actually really like that they're acknowledging these different elements. Then we have Bob the Pup, who wants to know, will Star Allies have multiple modes similar to Superstar? And yes, absolutely. It has 2 minigame modes, it has some unlockables as you get through the main story. I just don't know exactly what those are yet, but they are in the game, so there's a little bit more to this beyond the main story. Bly4 wants to know, is there any info you can share on the purpose of those puzzle piece collectibles? Are the puzzles just for show, or do they give some sort of reward like a bonus level? As I mentioned before, the bonus levels are actually unlocked by finding hidden switches in certain levels. As for the puzzles and pictures, they don't really seem to unlock anything yet, at least once you complete just one picture. I don't know what happens when you complete them all, but just doing one doesn't really do much else. But it is a nice picture, and it's sort of like this cool callback to some of the older games in the series, much in the same way as each of the keychains and stickers have different callbacks to the past games as well. This just follows along with that, but going for quality rather than quantity. It's just one of those things where I find it fun to collect, but you really don't need to if you don't have an interest, it seems like at least. Mediocre Gecko wants to know, how do the minigames in this Kirby game compare to the minigames from Robobot and Triple Deluxe? I haven't gotten to the longer form ones yet, but as far as the minigames compared to, let's say, DDD's Drum Dash, or Team Kirby Clash, or Blowout Blast, they are much shorter than those games, just because they're just one single minigame with 3 levels of difficulty for each one. And they're fun in their own right and meant to be played multiplayer, so like I said, I compare them more to Megaton Punch or the Samurai Showdown minigames from Superstar, because they're not really that fleshed out in the same way that DDD's Drum Dash is. And those games aren't even really that much fleshed out, but they are meant more for multiplayer than anything else, so that might be it. So again, I have to sort of wait for the extra modes to get unlocked to get a sense of how big and substantial those are, but the unlockable minigames right off the bat are about Superstar level. Youngster Skaymore wants to know, in the demo, while playing single player, I felt managing all of the CPU friends and abilities to be very hectic and distracting from the gameplay. Does this get easier? Also, is this game truly meant for multiplayer like Snipper Clips, or is single player equally good? I never had any issues managing all my CPU friends. Yeah, there's a lot in there, but unless you're constantly switching them back and forth, it doesn't really become much of an issue. And I always found that I had basically my power, my 3 friends' powers, and like, oh, that power looks good, and I want this many elements, I want this many physical abilities, or this weird one here. Let's go ahead and add that in, and that'll do the trick. And so I never really had much of a problem managing all of them together, and I think it's something that you'll get the hang of as you play through the game, because they don't toss a ton of different abilities at you all at once. The first level will get you acclimated with the basic abilities, and as you go along, you'll have a better sense of what you need to do. I think you'll take to it early on, and because of that, you can definitely enjoy this game single player, just have just as much fun. I'm sure multiplayer is even more fun, which I'm going to be finding out this coming week. But yeah, I think you can get this and play it on your own, much in the same way as Return to Dreamland, where it had multiplayer, but you could still completely have fun with it on your own. So yeah. Next up is Shad's Hedgie, who wants to know, what are the friend or team moves like? Are they hard to control? Not at all. I'm assuming you're talking about when all 4 characters come together. Now, I'm only controlling that on my own, so I'm not quite sure what the difference is when you're in multiplayer. But as far as the controls otherwise, it's very responsive, very quick, and with Friend Star you can go wherever you want on the screen, so it makes it very simple. So yeah, it's really easy to control, and they make for good set pieces as you do different things, and there's some standout ones that at least I got a kick out of, but we'll see what you guys think once the full game comes out. Next up is Riodial, who wants to know, can you move the characters with the D-pad? Yes, you absolutely can. And are there any returning mid-bosses from Return to Dreamland, Triple Deluxe, and Planet Robobot? Yeah, I'm assuming you're talking about characters like Bonkers and Mr. Frosty, and yeah, absolutely, those guys show back up. You can fight them just as normal, and I'm sure there's even more beyond that. As far as Planet Robobot, they probably won't have their mechanical appearances, so it's going to be a little different from that. But otherwise, yeah, the typical set of mini-bosses should be there and are, definitely there to fight. Next up is G Greninja 7, who wants to know, what's the English name of that stick ability? And I've seen this one actually quite a bit. And its English name is Staff, and honestly it's one of my favorite new abilities. It's just really fun to play with, and I just have a good time with it. And next up is Man F Artwitch, who wants to know, is there comparatively enough content for a $60 Kirby game to the last games, which were only $40? How is the replayability this time around, and further challenges and new things after the main story? Lastly, anything that would make fans freak out, like Robobot's End. So a lot of these questions I can't really answer, mainly because I haven't finished the game, so I don't know what the replayability is really like. I know there's challenges and new things after this main story, I just don't know exactly what they are. As far as the end, I don't know, but I have a feeling there's definitely going to be some things in here. There's a little something here and there that you guys are not aware of that I think is pretty cool. But as far as enough content for $60, that one's hard to determine. I definitely want to complete the game before I can even say anything like that. But you don't really have much longer to wait, as the embargo for the review is March 14th. So in 10 days, we'll have the review out. You guys can see my thoughts on Kirby Star Allies and how it all comes together in the end. Right now, I'm feeling pretty positive, but there are some things here and there that I'm a little worried about. Still, I'm having a good time from what I've been playing so far. Cannot wait to get back into it now that Switch Week is over, and hopefully I answered some of the questions you guys had about Star Allies. Thank you guys so much for asking these questions on Twitter, and of course, be sure to subscribe to GameXplain for even more on Kirby, including that upcoming review, and other things gaming as well. Until next time, bye.